One of my earliest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating around the neighborhood that I grew up in. I didn't have much of a costume because I only decided last minute that I wanted to join my big brother. I had been terrified at the idea of all these miniature monsters walking around outside, but that fear was gradually outweighed by the promise of a huge haul of Halloween candy. My mom used some leftover monster makeup to paint my face like a skeleton, and I wore a torn-up trash bag like I was some kind of garbage ghoul. I must have looked pretty silly compared to some of the other kids in their Batman and Superman costumes, but that didn't really bother me. All I was interested in was getting my fair share of candy, and boy, was there a lot of that. My brother was 13 at the time, so he agreed to escort 9-year-old me around the neighborhood with him and his friends from middle school. I couldn't believe that I had been so frightened by the whole thing, because actually being out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes, was some of the most fun I'd ever had in my entire young life. People were giving us a ton of candy, and not just candy either. They were giving us all kinds of things. One house we knocked at, I think it was the town dentist, gave us all toothbrushes and then reveled in our looks of disappointment before giving us some real candy. Another place gave us these miniature Charlie Brown comic books. But at one point, a man told me to open up my candy bag and dropped something small and white into it before walking off. I didn't realize Halloween was like Christmas, only spookier, and by the time my brother and I arrived back home, I think it had fast become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember, our mom asked us to empty out our bags of candy at either end of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take maybe 3/4 of what we'd gotten and put it somewhere safe so we couldn't eat ourselves into a diabetic coma. But shortly after emptying my bag onto the table, Mom came over to divide up the spoils, took one look through my candy, and immediately started to freak out. She kept pointing at this one particular item and asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" When I told her I didn't know, she kept yelling at me to think harder, that I had to remember who put it in my bag. I remember getting upset and starting to cry, and then crying even harder when my mom picked up the phone and told the operator to put her through to the police because, in her words, this was an emergency. Now, 30 years before, back when my mom was around my age, all the kids in the town went trick-or-treating on Halloween. One little girl went out with her friends but didn't just come home with a bag full of candy. She returned home with a little white doll stitched out of cloth rags. The girl's mom didn't think anything of it and let her daughter keep the little white doll. But just a few days later, there was an incident in a public park. The girl's mom took her to the park, someplace that had a sandpit and jungle gym, and while her kids were off playing with the other children, she struck up a conversation with one of the other moms. The whole time, some guy had been leaning on the fence surrounding the jungle gym. The lady figured that he must have been one of the kids' fathers, maybe even grandfathers, just watching on as his kids or grandkids played with all the others. But then, as the mom was looking on, she saw the guy get her daughter's attention, call her over toward the fence, and then start talking to her. Again, this all appeared perfectly harmless. But then the mom watched as the guy, who was wearing a long coat, hat, and scarf, his face slightly obscured, reached out and asked for her hand. The mom watched as her little girl gave the man her hand. And then, when the guy leaned forward and appeared to start smelling her little girl's hand, she walked over to intervene. She told her kid to get away from the strange man, then started asking him what his business was, talking to children like that. The guy didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked off before the mom could actually confront him. Naturally, the mom wanted to know what the man had said to her little girl, but when she asked her, the answer raised more questions than it answered. The little girl said she couldn't understand what the man was saying to her, but when her mom asked how she knew to walk over and give the man her hand at his direction, she acted very confused and said she didn't know. The girl also said that when she raised her hand to the man, he hadn't sniffed it like her mom thought. Instead, he'd said something to it, something which again the little girl couldn't understand. The girl's mom then asked if she knew the man from anywhere, like if she'd seen him around town. The girl replied, yes, it was the same man who'd given her the little white doll while she was trick-or-treating. As you can imagine, the mom was terrified. After discovering the connection between the doll and that creepy man, she rushed to inform the police. The cops put out an APB on the guy, and almost every cop in town was out looking for him. But after no one caught sight of him, They figured that he'd been a drifter that had skipped town at the first sight of trouble. None of the moms from the park recognized the guy, which in a town our size usually meant he wasn't local. So when 48 hours went by and there were no sightings of the guy from either civilians or law enforcement, everyone just kind of figured he had moved on. It took just days before they realized how wrong they were. One morning, a young mom walked into her daughter's bedroom to wake her up for elementary school, only to find that she wasn't in her bed. She looked around the house a little, and when she realized her daughter was nowhere to be found, she alerted her husband, who in turn called the cops. Within 24 hours, almost every cop in the state was out looking for this missing girl. While a whole army of cops and volunteers was out searching the fields and woods surrounding town, a team of state police detectives performed a search of the girl's bedroom. I'm guessing to see if they could find any clues. Then, guess what they found tucked into the missing girl's pillowcase? A little white doll, one that looked like it had been stitched out of old rags. The police then held a press conference asking if anyone else's kid was in possession of one of these little white dolls. Only one set of parents came forward, saying their little girl also had returned home from trick-or-treating with a little white doll in her candy bag. And that little girl just so happened to be my mom's best friend. I bet you thought I was going to say that little girl was my mom, didn't you? I can't blame you. So did I when I first heard that story from her. But even so, she was half traumatized by the whole thing because not only did her friend and her parents almost have a nervous breakdown out of fear, but they also ended up moving out of town because their kid just couldn't feel safe there anymore. Mom said that she and everyone at school were convinced the man would come back in the middle of the night and snatch her up out of bed, just like he'd done with that missing girl, who, by the way, was never found. No corpse or remains ever showed up anywhere. There were no credible witness sightings of her, despite all the public appeals. They didn't even find any articles of clothing or anything like that. It was like that little girl just vanished off the face of the earth. That only gave credence to the theory, propagated by local kids, that the child snatcher had been some kind of boogeyman who targeted children with little white dolls on Halloween before eating them alive on the nights that followed. Obviously, that's not what happened. But it wasn't like adults could tell their kids the whole truth either. All they could say was that the girl was lost and that everyone hoped she'd come home safe one day. But no one believed that. Not really anyway. In fact, a quick death would actually have been one of the more merciful options available, given the circumstances of a grown man abducting a little girl from her bed at night. I mean, again, it's unlikely the guy crept inside and snatched the kid, kicking and screaming from her bed. The dolls were to win the kid's trust, so when the time came, they'd come quietly. And go quietly she did, because as I said, no one found any trace of this girl or her abductor, and she was declared legally dead around the same time I graduated college. The town moved on, but no one forgot, especially the ones close to the whole thing, which explained why my mom got so scared when she emptied my bag of candy onto the table and saw a little white doll stitched out of old rags lying among the chocolate bars and candy wrappers. As you can imagine, she too rushed to call 911. After the cops got a hold of the little white doll, the whole town basically went into lockdown while they searched for the person who might have placed it in my bag. No kid was allowed to go anywhere alone for days. When the commotion died down, the cops said it was most likely some kind of copycat just looking to scare people. They figured it was probably some teenager who'd heard the story of the little white dolls, along with that of the girl who went missing just days after they were handed out. They didn't think they were seriously going to complete the copycat process and try to abduct any kids who received dolls. I wasn't the only one, but given the heavy police presence on the streets come November 1st, there was a good chance it was that and that alone which deterred the copycat from going through with it. I didn't hear the whole story until many years later, and while my dad thought the whole thing was dumb and that it was just kids being kids, it had quite a heavy effect on my mom. I guess because it brought back all those bad memories from her childhood. I mostly believe it was a copycat too, as in someone just playing a dumb prank, because no one ever tried to snatch any of us kids who got the dolls, not even years later. But sometimes, I wonder how much of a prank it really was. If the whole town didn't take the dolls seriously, or the guy hadn't picked my candy bag to drop one into so that my mom didn't see it, would things have still happened the way they did? Or would another kid have gone missing in the middle of the night, snatched up by the man who made the little white dolls? On the night of Halloween in 1977, The parents of 19-month-old Nema Louise Carter laid her down in her crib and kissed her goodnight. The Carters lived in Lawton, Oklahoma, a city of around 90,000 that serves as the seat of Comanche County. Developed on former reservation lands of the Comanche and Apache peoples, Lawton was incorporated in 1901. It was named after Major General Henry Ware Lawton, who served in the Civil War, where he earned the Medal of Honor before being killed in action in the Philippine-American War. Lawton's landscape is typical of the Great Plains, with flat topography and gently rolling hills, while the area north of the city is marked by the Wichita Mountains. Although Lawton's economy is still largely dependent on Fort Sill, it has grown to encompass higher education, healthcare, retail, and manufacturing, the latter of which employed Nema's father, George Carter. After laying their young daughter down to sleep, the Carters retired to their own bedroom to get some well-deserved rest. But upon waking the next morning, they discovered they had stepped out of their dreams and into every parent's worst nightmare. Little Nema's crib was empty, and she was nowhere to be found. After contacting the police, officers were dispatched to the Carters' home, where statements were taken and a search was performed. The officers primarily wished to identify the method by which Nema's abductor had gained entry to the Carter family home. But after a thorough analysis of the house, they came to a deeply chilling conclusion. Since Nema's bedroom windows had apparently remained locked during the night of her abduction, and the possibility of forced entry had been ruled out, officers were faced with a horrifying possibility. Nema's abductor had surreptitiously entered the home during daylight hours before hiding in her bedroom closet until her parents were asleep. Then, and only then, would they have been able to carry little Nema out of the house without ever alerting her adoring parents. Nema's abduction sent shockwaves through the local community, with police encouraging members of the public to be on the lookout for signs of suspicious activity. No one could fathom why someone would want to abduct a 19-month-old child, but it seemed inconceivable that the suspect's intentions were murderous. The entirety of the search effort that followed hinged on the possibility that little Nema was still alive and that someone was holding her with the intention of transporting her out of state. But the reality was far more horrifying. Around a month after Nema's abduction, a group of school children were exploring an abandoned house around 4 blocks away from where the Carter family lived. The house had been heavily vandalized, its insides a mess of broken glass and rough graffiti, but whoever had once owned the home had left most of its furnishings behind. As the kids explored the house, their curiosity drove them to open cabinets, closets, and cupboards, all in the hopes of uncovering some long-lost loot, until they wandered into the home's dilapidated kitchen. Their finds were all trash and no trinkets. Suddenly, one of the kids noticed the house's fridge and wondered aloud if there was any food inside. With ghoulish inquisitiveness, the boy's friends encouraged him to open the appliance's door. The boy did as they willed him, approached the fridge and swung open the door. But instead of being greeted by the sight of rotten vegetables and maggot-ridden meat, what the children saw that day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lying on one of the fridge's bare glass shelves was the suffocated, decomposing body of little Nema Carter. Lawton has always been something of a rough-and-ready place and was no stranger to petty and sometimes violent crime. But the abduction of children in the middle of the night was unheard of, or at least almost unheard of. Just the previous year, on April 8th of 1976, twin sisters Mary and Tina Carpenter were abducted in broad daylight while they watched TV in their grandmother's house. According to the report, a friend of the Carpenter twins unlatched the living room door before coaxing the 2 girls outside. The 2 3-year-olds followed, but were soon met by 16-year-old Jacqueline Rubidoux, who began dragging the girls down the street. In phone calls to the police, witnesses claimed the Carpenter twins were crying and trying to free themselves from Rubidoux's grip. They urged the police to hurry, but by the time officers arrived at the scene, Rubidoux and her 2 victims were nowhere to be found. Several years later, in an interview with local law enforcement, a 10-year-old Tina Carpenter said, "She took us to a house. It was white, near railroad tracks. There was broken furniture inside. When we got in there, she took us to the refrigerator and told us to get in. She said her aunt will be there to get us out and take us for ice cream later." The Carpenter twins did as they were told, too terrified of Rubidoux to risk disobeying her. But once inside, Rubidoux simply slammed the door closed and ran away. 2 days later, a group of children were playing in a deserted house when they heard weak groans coming from a grungy refrigerator. An 11-year-old girl named Kathy Ford and another neighborhood child bravely opened the refrigerator door, and Tina Carpenter tumbled out, exhausted, terrified, but alive. Miraculously, Tina had survived by breathing through a tiny hole in the refrigerator. Her twin sister, on the other hand, was not so fortunate and passed away as a result of prolonged asphyxiation. When police questioned Kathy Ford, she claimed to have immediately asked the exhausted Tina, "Who locked you in the fridge?" Tina's reply was almost instantaneous and used the 16-year-old Rubidoux's nickname when she stated, Jackie Bew. Rubidoux, who happened to be Kathy Ford's babysitter on account of being friends with her aunt, instantly became the target of a police investigation. Yet, under the assumption that 3-year-old Tina would prove an unreliable witness, a lack of physical evidence left the authorities desperate for a straight-up confession. Without it, the investigation quickly stalled. In the end, the police had no choice but to release Jackie Rubidoux without charge. But the news was met with apprehension and unease from those in the local community. People were scared. Real scared, recalled Ray Anderson, an investigator for the Comanche County District Attorney. They were asking themselves, how could this happen? Why would someone target such a young and innocent child like that? Folks were going out and buying guns, new locks for their doors, fitting bars to their kids' windows. You could feel how scared they were. Following her arrest and release, Jackie maintained a quiet, unassuming presence around town. And somehow, she managed to claw back enough of her reputation that folks began hiring her to babysit for them again. By the fall of 1977, she was a regular babysitter for the Carters, the young Native American couple who led active weekend social lives and were well acquainted with their infant daughter. She was also their first choice of babysitter during the period an intruder lifted Nema from her crib with the windows locked, crept down the hallway of the tiny Lawton home past her sleeping parents, and out through the front door. I remember the next morning like it was yesterday, Nema's father George later recalled. It was one of those cool, crisp Oklahoma mornings, a day I might have otherwise enjoyed immensely. Instead, he and his wife were condemned to endure the worst nightmare of young parents everywhere. Someone had snatched their infant child. George later said his heart raced so badly that he thought he was having a heart attack and that in her panic, his wife Rose began frantically searching the most irrational of places. She ran between kitchen cabinets, closets, and the family doghouse. She even checked underneath the house and in the field behind the backyard fence. But little Nema was nowhere to be found. During the initial phases of the investigation, and given the high percentage of parental involvement in missing child cases, detectives had no choice but to consider George and Rose, Nema's own parents, as preliminary suspects. Naturally, we called them in for questioning, recalled Cecil Davidson, a retired Lawton police detective who worked the case. They agreed to take lie detector tests, and each passed with flying colors. Once the parents were ruled out as suspects, almost everyone fell under the net of suspicion, including neighborhood babysitters Joyce Smith and Jacqueline Rubidoux. It's amazing that it took us that long to put it together, recalled Davidson. But someone eventually remembered that Jackie Rubidoux had been implicated in an almost identical crime not even a year before. After that, it was all eyes on her. When Detective Davidson finally confronted Rubidoux regarding Nema Carter's abduction and murder, her response was cagey, to say the least. Rubidoux claimed that she was playing bingo the night Nema disappeared, and at first, her alibi seemed airtight. But as Davidson continued to question her, he began to doubt Rubidoux's innocence. She was very quiet, Davidson recalled. She never looked you in the eyes. Her gaze was always somewhere else or looking at the ground. She would always get real close to telling you something critical, and then she'd back right off like she was scared to incriminate herself. In light of this, Detective Davidson remained almost convinced of Rubidoux's guilt but lamented the case's lack of closure. We could never get her to confess, he later said. The frustrating part was we had no physical evidence. No fingerprints, no footprints, no hair, no blood, nothing. The only thing I think we really had was this odd response I got from her about bingo. She was very angry about the fact that everybody got to play bingo while she would get stuck babysitting, Davidson explained. To this day, I'm convinced Jackie Rubidoux murdered Nema, but the district attorney never felt that we had enough to prosecute. Detective Davidson might be unshakable in his belief, but not everyone is convinced that Jackie Rubidoux abducted and murdered little Nema Carter, including her own father, George. 2 months prior to Nema's abduction, the Carters found their dog poisoned. A few days later, they returned home to discover it was trashed by vandals. I find it hard to think all those events were mere coincidence, George said. The Jackie Rubidoux we knew, no, it just doesn't add up. I never sensed that about her. Whenever Jackie came over, Nema would run up to her and give her a big hug, but several years ago, George saw an interview with Jackie in a newspaper, and in it, she said that she was on drugs during that time in her life. Was it someone we knew? George was asked. I think so. Someone who was familiar with our house. But I've never been fully convinced it was Jackie. George, whose wife Rose died in 2000, is plagued by the haunting reality that no one was ever charged with his infant daughter's murder. He claimed the passage of a long 3 decades had helped ease his pain a little, but as he so poetically phrased it, unanswered questions still burn within. In the initial aftermath of her murder, detectives became convinced they had positively identified Nema's killer and their suspect, Jackie Rubidoux. Yet they, too, have been left with a sense of unfulfilled justice. My wife and I lived for years with the what-ifs, said George Carter, who is now an active member of his local church. Nema cried that night when we put her down to sleep, and we never got up to check on her. We figured that we didn't want to spoil her, that she would eventually go to sleep. He continued, and now I think that person who took her was already in her room, probably hiding in the closet. What if we had opened the closet? What if we had gotten up to check her that night? What if we brought her in to sleep with us? My name's Chris, and I'm from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I've been meaning to share a story about a childhood friend of mine named Kevin, and how we eventually lost touch. Since that story starts on Halloween night of 1993, it's something I often think about this time of year. It's kind of sad in parts, but I find scary stories are like that sometimes because that thing that's so terrible and terrifying, it often has consequences, and rarely do they make for happy endings. Kevin and I lived on Dent Avenue, on opposite sides of the East Jerusalem Baptist Church, and were friends all throughout elementary school. Then, once we graduated to middle school, we had a solid 4-kid friend group that consisted of me, Kevin, a kid named Toby who lived on Frederick Street, and Todd, whose parents ran the seafood place up on East Hardy Street. We were practically inseparable at school and at home, but especially on Saturday nights. That includes the night of October 30th, 1993. We were planning on trick-or-treating the following night, but just like every Saturday, we walked around to each other's homes until the whole crew was assembled. We usually just walked around the neighborhood until we found somewhere to hang out, which was usually the ballpark of Rebecca Avenue or some of the derelict housing plots near Alcorn. But that night, since it was the night before Halloween, we had something a little different in mind. We were talking about which places in Hattiesburg we believed were haunted. There was Vernon D's old place, no relation to Jeffrey, who was murdered by the Klan back in the 60s for being a civil rights activist. His house wasn't there anymore, just a bare plot, but lots of folks said that they felt an eerie presence around the place and others even heard weird sounds. But since Vernon's place was at least 5 or 6 miles out of town, we weren't about to try and walk out there on a Saturday night. We also had the old train yard, which was supposedly haunted, and the old Hattiesburg Cemetery was also an obvious choice for some guaranteed spookiness. But at some point, someone brought up the old derelict house at the end of Elizabeth Avenue. The old plantation-style 2-story home with its wraparound veranda, tall columns, and large shuttered windows had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. I don't think it was ever part of an actual plantation. I think it was more of a case of its owner wanting it to look as grand as possible, and it must have been quite a place back when it was still occupied. But by 1993, it was nothing but a crumbling, termite-infested, ramshackle ruin, and it looked spooky as hell. Though, unlike the old derelict place or the Hattiesburg Cemetery, we hadn't actually heard any rumors that the abandoned house was haunted. Maybe that's what attracted us to it in the first place. I mean, the place looked like it should have been haunted, so in our minds, it pretty much was. But that also gave us a free pass to avoid visiting any of the places we'd actually heard were haunted. Sort of like, we're not chickens, we're just very lazy. And so we walked all the way down Dent Avenue, crossed Gulfport Street, and then we were walking down Elizabeth Avenue, discussing what might have happened to result in the home being completely abandoned. I remember Todd suggesting that the family patriarch had gone insane, slaughtered his family, and that the home's bloody history meant that it couldn't be resold. Toby then suggested that some kind of tragic accident had resulted in restless spirits being anchored to the place, and that's why it couldn't be resold. We danced around a couple of other theories, but the reality was that none of us really knew why that old house on Elizabeth Avenue was abandoned. All we knew was that the chances of encountering spectral activity there had to be lower than at the train yard or cemetery, and that in all likelihood, nothing bad would happen hanging out there. But we could not have been more wrong. On the way down the street, we'd been full of boyish bravado, as they say, but once we arrived at the end of Elizabeth Avenue and saw that the old house was looming there before us, none of us felt quite so adventurous anymore. We talked about exploring it, finding ghosts, or maybe even buried treasure or some kind of dark family secret. But once we were face to face with it, no one felt like going inside. I remember thinking how the old plantation house didn't look nearly so spooky in the daytime, and that even though I knew in my gut that there was nothing in there but dust and cobwebs, I still couldn't bring myself to venture inside. We all just kind of stood there murmuring to each other about how dangerous it looked. And then suddenly, Todd dared me to go inside. I remember saying something like, "Alone? No way, man, you must be crazy. You think I'm going there on my own?" Todd then dared Toby to go inside, and he said pretty much the same thing. But then, when he dared Kevin to go inside, even for just a minute, Kevin replied with, "And what are you going to give me if I do?" Todd thought for a moment, but Kevin clearly had something in mind already. He said that he'd go inside, up into a bedroom or down into a basement, and bring back something to prove that he'd been there, and in return, he wanted at least half of Todd's candy haul from that following night on Halloween. Todd said something like, "No way," and I even thought that that was a little much of a hard bargain. But eventually they settled on this. For every minute that Kevin spent out of our sight anywhere in the house, he got one fistful of candy from Todd's trick-or-treating bag the next day. Kevin said that he wanted a souvenir from the place anyway, something that proved that he was the bravest of all of us. But we were all convinced that he wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 minutes, with Todd being perhaps the most confident of all of us that he wouldn't have to give up more than maybe a few fistfuls of candy. We watched Kevin walk off through the overgrown grass towards the steps of the porch, which creaked as he climbed them before he walked toward the home's open threshold. I remember the door had been completely taken off the hinges, so there was nothing but an ominous black orifice waiting for him. And when he reached it, Kevin looked back at Todd and told him to be ready to count the minutes. Todd then checked his watch and gave Kevin the thumbs up. Then, after flicking on the cigarette lighter that he borrowed from Toby, Kevin crept into the darkness. To say that first minute was tense would be the understatement of the century. I remember half expecting Kevin to suddenly scream and then come running out of the house, yelling at us to scram. And I also remember thinking how that would be an incredible way to prank us. But running out too soon would mean forfeiting a whole bunch of Todd's candy, and I guess that if he did weigh it up in his head, he figured getting his hands on more candy was a superior outcome to scaring the living crap out of us. Because when it hit the end of that first minute, there was no sign of him. When the second minute ended, then the third, and then the fourth, and none of us had heard so much as a peep from Kevin. I remember Toby looking at Todd and saying something like, "If he keeps this up, you're not going to have any candy left after all that trick-or-treating tomorrow." And Todd actually started to panic because 5 or 6 handfuls was going to be quite a lot of candy, and they hadn't yet negotiated if fistfuls meant 2 fistfuls or just the one, etc., etc. By the time Kevin had been in that house for a full 5 minutes, Todd marched around halfway through the grass towards the house and yelled something out like, "All right, Kevin, you made your point. You got your candy. Now come on out." I almost expected Kevin to just appear from around the doorframe right then and there and show us how he just tricked us into thinking that he'd been lost in the bowels of the basement or something, when really he'd been standing feet away from us, probably stifling laughter while listening to Todd getting increasingly frustrated. But after Todd called out for him to come out and give it up, the entire house stayed quiet, quiet as the grave, and Toby started to laugh very nervously, telling Todd that Kevin was going to stay in there so long that Todd would be practically working for him during trick-or-treating the following night. I laughed, But Todd didn't find it very funny and yelled again for Kevin to come outside before the spiders started climbing up the leg of his pants. The idea of that sure would have motivated me to skip out of there at full speed, but Kevin didn't make a sound. It was like he couldn't even hear us at all. We were coming up to 10 minutes when the mood shifted from nervous excitement to minor concern. And by then, all three of us were much closer to the old plantation house and were all calling out Kevin's name in the hopes that he'd come out if he heard. All of us calling him, and not just one of us. And we started to sound scared, too. I remember Toby's voice kind of trembling as he called out one time, and how his fear was almost infectious. We called out a little longer, and then Todd suddenly announced that he'd have to go inside and actually look for Kev. I think Toby knew as well as I did that it wasn't about the candy anymore. We were just scared for our friend by that point. Todd started up the steps, with me and Toby reluctantly following. But when he finally got within a few feet of the open doorway, we started to hear movement from inside. Todd called out again, "Kevin, is that you?" But when we got no response, that fear came back tenfold. We started backing up, half expecting some rotten, stinking monster thing to come lurching out into the moonlight with Kevin's blood on its claws and teeth. Whatever it was moved very slow, without urgency. Just these slow, steady footsteps as it came closer and closer to the door. We kept walking backward, getting ready to run, but then suddenly, who steps out into the moonlight but Kevin? We all breathed this huge sigh of relief because he was walking fine, not running, and he had no signs of any wound or injuries, either. Todd said, "What the hell? Dude, you scared the crap out of us." I was waiting on Kevin to just burst out laughing before calling all of us a bunch of scaredy cats. He'd secured at least 6 or 7 handfuls of Todd's candy and managed to have all of us on the verge of wetting our pants. If that were me, I'd be doing a victory lap of the place's overgrown front yard. But Kevin didn't do anything like that. Instead, he just walked right past us, across the grass, and started walking back down Elizabeth Avenue, with me and the others asking, "Kevin? Kevin, where you going, dude?" Todd, Toby, and I all just kind of stood there looking at each other for a moment, as if to ask what the hell's gotten into him. And then we followed him up the street, asking what had happened inside that house. Like I said, we hadn't heard so much as a mouse's fart up there. It had been complete silence the whole time, so we wanted to know what Kevin had been doing for so long. He also wasn't acting scared either. At least he wasn't running. He was just walking away like he was tired and wanted to go home. Toby and I ran around to the front of him because he wouldn't respond to a word we were saying. And we said, "Hello? Kevin? What's going on? What happened in there?" It was only then that I saw how Kevin had tears in his eyes. Both Toby and I were saying, "Dude, what the hell? What's gotten into you?" And then Toby tried to physically get him to stop. But I remember how Kevin, instead of stopping, went from all calm to furiously violent as he shoved Toby off of him and screamed, "Get the hell away from me!" He screamed it so loud his voice broke. Like, it started as a roar and ended in some kind of squeal. And we were so stunned that we stopped dead in our tracks and just let him walk on for a second before we carried on following him. No one knew what to say at first. It was kind of scary to see him freak out like that in the first place. But as we carried on following Kevin up the avenue, we started calling after him again. We asked him to stop, asked him to talk to us, and then asked him to at least slow down a little bit. But again, he completely ignored us until it was Todd's turn to jog ahead of him in an attempt to block his path. Kevin tried to avoid Todd by walking around him without saying a word, but then Todd stepped in front of him again. Kevin started swinging. Todd leaned back so hard to avoid the punches that he fell on his ass. And then me and Toby ran over, trying to separate them, and Kevin started swinging on us, too. He started screaming, "Don't touch me! Keep away from me!" Again, his voice was cracking like he was fighting back tears, and all the time I'd known him, I'd never known Kevin to act like that. He looked crazy. His eyes were wild, his face was red, and he was serious about hurting us if we got too close. I mean, he moved on Todd so fast that Todd fell on his butt. And if me and Toby hadn't have blocked Kevin off when we did, then Todd would have probably ended up fighting him. We wanted nothing more than for him to just tell us what had happened in that house. But if he didn't want to tell us, then there'd be no getting him to do it. I guess we just had no choice but to let him go. I mean, he had nowhere else to go but home. So after Todd got to his feet, we let Kevin walk on a while before he turned off in the direction of his house and disappeared from view. Toby, Todd, and I then walked back toward our houses because I didn't want to follow Kevin back in the direction that he was going, just in case he saw me following him and decided that he wanted to beat me up. I guess I was pretty badly shaken up from seeing him like that in the first place. So I walked with Toby and Todd for a while, and we tried to work out what had happened back in that old plantation house. Toby was convinced that Kevin had seen some kind of ghost or spirit because, to him, nothing else explained why he was so scared. But Todd didn't buy it. He thought Kevin had seen something scary enough for him to react the way that he did. But it couldn't have been a ghost because, as he put it, ghosts aren't real. He figured it might have been maybe a dead body, an old bloodstain, or even like a man-sized cage in the basement. It was something creepy enough to scare the crap out of him. But there's no way that Kevin saw a ghost then just walked out of the building without telling us. It had disturbed him very deeply, but I guess it wasn't a threat. It seems ridiculous all these years later, but at no point did any of us even think to go back and take a look around that house ourselves, so we could actually know for ourselves what Kevin had seen. But we were just kids, man, just scared young kids, and all we wanted to do was just go home and hope Kevin would just tell us what had happened the following evening when we went out trick-or-treating. The next day, I remember calling Kevin's house to see if I could talk to him. His mom answered the phone, and she sounded just fine at first. But when I asked if I could talk to Kevin, she said that he was feeling under the weather and couldn't come to the phone. I asked if he was okay, and she said yes, but that he was upstairs taking a nap after complaining of feeling very sick. I remember pausing for a few moments, so long that Kevin's mom asked if I was still there, and only then did I find it in myself to ask her if he'd been acting strange when he returned home the previous night. It was her turn to pause, just long enough to let me know that her answer wasn't as natural as she wanted it to sound. And then she told me no, Kevin had been just fine. He just woke up that morning feeling a little worse for wear. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't quite telling the truth either. She was covering for him. Understandably so. She was his mom, but why? And before I hung up, Kevin's mom said that she had no reason to believe he wasn't coming trick-or-treating with us, and that she'd get him to call me back whenever he woke up from his nap. I waited and waited but got no call from Kevin, so I decided to just call him a second time, and that's when I got the news that he was still feeling under the weather and wouldn't be coming out trick-or-treating with us. I was devastated, but not so much because he wasn't heading out with us. It was more because I knew that whatever happened was still affecting him, and in a deep enough way that he turned down the opportunity to grab as much candy as he could carry. Trick-or-treating was huge for all of us, so for Kevin to miss, it was a big deal. Todd and Toby knew that too. It was almost impossible to enjoy ourselves out there, though. So much so that we ended up heading over to Kev's house to give him a share of our candy. We were desperate to see him, desperate to make sure that he was at least kind of okay. But when we got to his door, his mom told us that he was too sick for visitors. And he stayed sick, and I put that in quotation marks, for about a week before I got a chance to get him on the phone. And I asked that one time if he wanted to talk about what had happened back in that house. He told me, word for word, that if I ever asked about it again, he wouldn't be my friend anymore. So I didn't. I resisted the temptation for as long as I knew him, but Kev was never the same kid. He walked into that house as one guy and came out as a different one. And for the life of us, no one could figure out why. Todd and Toby and I were too scared to head back into the house on Elizabeth Avenue for fear of the same thing happening to us. Kevin had also told the two guys the same thing he told me, that he didn't want to talk about it under pain of excommunication, so they ended up biting their tongues about it too. That wasn't the end of the story, though. And we didn't think it was any coincidence that the old plantation house on Elizabeth Avenue ended up getting demolished not even 6 months after Kevin walked into it. And that was the closest I ever came to breaking my promise and asking what he saw in there, because that demolition day really was the last chance to see for ourselves. And again, there wasn't any way in hell that I was going in there alone, not even in the daytime. Maybe I should have asked, but I just didn't want to lose a friend as old as Kevin, even though he was a little different from the kid I knew before. Kevin's family stayed in Hattiesburg for about another year, long enough to graduate 8th grade, and then he told us one day that he was moving away. Kev moved up to Jacksonville, apparently because his mom wanted to be closer to her parents during their old age. We tried to keep in touch with him, but we always seemed way more interested in continuing the friendship than he did. Like, we'd ask him on the phone if he ever wanted to come back and visit us. And he'd always say, "I don't know, I'll have to see what my mom has to say." He was just never very enthusiastic about it. And eventually, Toby and Todd and I just kind of took that hint, and before long, we lost touch for good. Many years later, I found a Facebook account with what I thought was his name, but it had no picture attached to the profile, so there was no way of me really knowing for sure. I sent a friend request, but it was never accepted. I guess Kevin just didn't use it all that much. I hoped that he'd accept it one day, maybe get my number off of somebody and give me a call. But about 10 years back, we got some bad news. Kevin had passed from a drug overdose. Heroin, they said, and he hadn't even hit 40 yet. At the funeral, we heard from folks who knew him up in Jacksonville that he'd been struggling with addiction for years. None of us had any idea, but it really hit home when we heard people say that he begged almost everyone for money whenever he was broke. He never begged any of us. And hell, I'd probably have given him all the money he needed just to talk to him after all those years. But he didn't reach out, even in his worst desperation. He never came back to Hattiesburg. And I think that has everything to do with what he saw in that house on Elizabeth Avenue on the night before Halloween all those years before. At the funeral, I ended up getting the phone number of Kev's old Narcotics Anonymous sponsor. He was the guy who probably knew Kev the best up in Jacksonville, as he spent a great deal of time with him in the years leading up to his death. He talked about his addiction at the funeral, and the guy told me that if I ever wanted to hear a few less depressing anecdotes regarding Kev's last few years, I should give him a call. Well, I did give him a call, but it was only to ask him if Kev had ever mentioned the night of October 30th way back when we were young, and more specifically, what had happened in the house. He told me no, that Kevin had never mentioned it. Not even once. He and Kev had talked about all kinds of things from his childhood, and he even mentioned us a couple of times. I thanked the guy, hung up the phone, and cried. Not because I didn't get to find out Kev's terrible secret, but because I realized guarding it so hard might have just ended up killing him. Rest in peace, Kev. I still miss you, buddy.